It really gives me great pleasure to introduce our closing plenary speaker, Professor David Armstrong. We're going to revert to our normal practice with this plenary, so we won't be having questions at the end, but at least that's going to leave you something to discuss over lunch, as if you needed something more to discuss over lunch. So without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Professor Armstrong.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. I've got the tail end of a cold, so I might sound a little bit more sexier than I really am. but I hope you can hear me and hear what I'm saying. I'm going to talk about Durkheim's body and the sorts of questions that might immediately come to mind are these sorts of issues, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you and say I'm not going to give you answers to these questions. And the reason why I'm not going to give you answers to these questions is because these are questions that belong to a different body. They don't belong to Durkheim's body, they belong to a different body, which we're all much more familiar with. And that is the biological body. And if we think about when the biological body emerged, it could only emerge with biology itself at the very beginning of the 19th century, when natural history replaced biology in the sciences, and the human body, which hadn't existed, natural history didn't have humans as an object of study, moved centre stage in biology. And of course, half a century later, famously, Charles Darwin provided in his Origin of Species and Descent of Man an account of the body's origins and added this evolutionary trajectory to the biological paradigm. And that's all well known. And so this Darwinian body, which we can call, I think, Darwin's body, was based on biology and anatomy, and the theory of evolution came together, and in 2012 we have this now very familiar body, and those sorts of questions I posed at the beginning are, of course, the sorts of things one might ask about the biological body. It's anatomical, physiological, genetic, molecular. And in fact, a few years ago, 3 years ago, there was international celebrations of the 150th anniversary of the Origin of Species, and there was a number of worldwide events and publications. 2012, there is also another centenary, which I believe has been a small symposium in Paris, but otherwise has been unrecognised across the world, except in Leicester. So I'm very pleased to celebrate this moment with you, because this is a centenary of a very remarkable book that was published in 1912 by Durkheim called Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. It wasn't made accessible in English for 3 years later, but it seems to me appropriate to celebrate it now today. It's 100 years old. And whereas Darwin's books, of course, are known worldwide, this is a little bit more esoteric. So Darwin's body is the dominant one. That's the one we automatically think about when we think of the body, but it is only one narrative. And what I want to do in this plenary session is to look at the alternatives, and that alternative derives from Durkheim's work in the Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. Now, there's a lot of stuff in there which is actually a bit boring and probably wrong in that book, but there's also some brilliant theoretical insights. And I think one of them is encapsulated in this quotation, and there's many more very similar in the book, where he says, the ideas of time, space, class, cause, and personality are constructed out of social elements. And it seems to me this is the beginning of his sociology of religion. It's also the beginning of a sociology of knowledge, which we can then apply to the human body and have a different reading of it, which is not the same as Darwin's. So we can apply this to the human body and try and work it out. So he's saying that space, time, and cause, and so on, the fundamental categories of human thought are constructed out of social elements. They're not pre-social, they don't just exist in the human mind, but they're actually generated from social circumstances. So Durkheim's body is not a biological constant, as Darwin's body is, but it clearly changes over time, because that body reflects these social elements, and equally these social elements can be read from that Durkheim's body. So if I can give you some examples of how this would work, if we look at space and classification, which are intimately linked, Durkheim said that the notion of space derives from the collective experience of the social group. And he identified the fundamental decision was a binary one between the sacred and profane. He said that was the first basis of classification. that primitive communities separated off the sacred and profane. And he argued that this binary classification then gets moved on into identifying something that is, something that isn't. Space A, space B, A, not B, and so on. And that becomes the basis of all our subsequent classifications. Now, Mary Douglas, a medical anthropologist, has taken that idea of the difference between sacred and profane by arguing that these two are not separated by a single line, but there's actually a space, there can be a space between objects in this classification system. And she gave lots of examples from Leviticus in her book Purity and Danger. And for example, she said there were animals on land with legs, and on the other hand there were fish in the sea with scales. But therefore, if you came across a shellfish, you came across a crab on the beach, well, this has got legs, but it lives in the sea. This is anomalous, and because it's anomalous, it's therefore seen as dangerous, and therefore eating it is proscribed in the Jewish religion. So the classification basis of the way you classified animals in the world gave you categories which were sacred and profane, which were pure, impure, which were dangerous and not dangerous. Now, I think we can apply this idea to the human body, because we can look at different regimes of hygiene, because the way we look at hygiene in our society is that some things are dirty and therefore dangerous, and some things are clean. That's the essential basis of hygiene. And that danger can come from many places, and therefore by studying the source of the danger, we can begin to see what is the underlying classification. The classification doesn't sort of stare us in the face immediately. We've got to look, where's the danger, because as Mary Douglas pointed out, picking out the dangerous points tell you what the structures are that surround it. Now, in the mid-19th century, in public health, there were a whole series of new dangerous elements emerged, which hadn't been there earlier in the century. Feces, urine, contaminated food, smelly air, masturbation, dirty water, dental sepsis. A whole lot of phenomena occurred that people were very concerned about. And in response, they generated this new regime of public health, which we now call sanitary science. So sanitary science was the new hygiene which was going to protect the population. Now, what did it involve? If you start grouping the different elements that were seen as dangerous into things that go into the body and things that go out of the body, you can see what they're doing is somehow marking out a body boundary. The dangerous things are things that cross the body boundary going into the body, and the dangerous things that come out of the body, instead of just sort of defecating by the side of the road, you can't do that because feces are dirty. Instead of just having a chew on a piece of meat and offering it around the table and saying, this is very tasty, that is dangerous because it has been contaminated by entering the body. So what this new sanitary science did in effect was guard a permeable body boundary. The body boundary couldn't be put into quarantine with a cordon sanitaire all around it. There had to be some permeability because things had to go in and things had to come out. And of course, in this schema, there were problematic places, and the two particular problematic ones was the mouth and the colon, because things went into the mouth. Was this in the body, or was it not quite in the body? And as I've said, things like once they'd entered the mouth became particularly problematic. You couldn't take them out and share them round. And equally, there's a new medical specialty emerges at this time, the largest medical specialty, whose job is policing the mouth, and that is dentistry. And we still regularly go to have our mouths policed because these are dangerous places. And equally, the colon, which now stores feces, which are dangerous things, they've got to be taken away and decontaminated, now becomes potentially dangerous. And if you want, you can have a little tube stuck up and irrigate it out. So there are different ways of handling these dangerous places. About the same time, or slightly earlier, there's a creation of the anatomical body in another register. Early 19th century, a new clinical model emerges, which we now are very familiar with. We call the clinic, hospital medicine, pathological medicine, Western medicine, biomedicine, lots of synonyms for it. But essentially, it was based on three elements, new elements to clinical medicine. One was the clinical examination, where doctors physically examined and studied bodies. Secondly was the post-mortem. After death, the bodies were cut open to identify the cause of death. And thirdly, the placing patients into hospitals, into hospital beds, where they could be properly studied and these examinations conducted. Now, if you want to summarize what this new biomedicine was all about, it was about analysing the body's interior. That hadn't occurred before. In the 18th century, doctors had not opened up bodies, they hadn't examined bodies, they didn't feel they needed to because that wasn't what that form of medicine was about. So this was an analysis of the body interior, and if you put that together with public health, you can see there are two parallel processes happening in the middle of the 19th century. On the one hand, public health is policing the boundaries of the body, and on the other hand, clinical medicine is examining the internal structures. Now, it seems to me putting these two elements together, we begin to get the emergence, the materialization of this anatomical body, which of course was represented classically in Gray's Anatomy, still in its whatever edition, which first appeared in 1858. In the 18th century, there were conceptions of the body, and in the main, these were concerned with identifying four humours. The imbalances of these humours caused disease. Now, this was a very different body that people could see in the 18th century. It was constructed of humours, which they diagnosed, the ups and downs of humours. And nowadays, if you ask any doctor to say, what's my humoral balance like, they won't have a clue. We can't even identify these things, which was so commonplace in the 18th century. We also know that other societies have other views of what defines and constitutes the body, but our legacy from that period is our anatomical bodies were forged in those central decades of the 19th century. That's where they came about, and via these various processes. Now, in the early 20th century, new sources of danger emerged, which hadn't been there in the 19th century. A lot of discussion about school infections, venereal disease, tuberculosis, and so on, and the neuroses. How did these materialize and how did they affect public health? Well, there was a new form of public health emerged. Sanitary science became a bit of a backwater, and there's a new interpersonal hygiene emerged. Now, this interpersonal hygiene, which was called preventive medicine in the States and social medicine in the continental Europe, the danger lay not in nature coming across the body boundary, but in other bodies. It was other bodies which were potentially hazardous to the individual. Because other bodies, there was a physical space across which things could travel. And so this concentration on diseases which crossed boundaries. So tuberculosis, it wasn't a disease of insanitary conditions, it was a disease of coughing. It was a disease of coughing and passing on the bug to other people. Venereal disease, there's contact tracing came in, venereal disease clinics and so on, all to do with mapping that physical space between individuals, and also began to get the idea of contagion in schools where children with spots would be sent home because they might infect other children. But this space between bodies was also something else. There was also a psychosocial space between bodies, and that was apparent through the materialization of the neuroses. So all the mental illness problems of the 19th century had been entirely concerned with madness. In the early 20th century, we get this whole new category of mental disorder called the neuroses, which we now know as anxiety and depression, which are the commonest diseases, and they emerged in this psychosocial space in the early 20th century. And of course, to study these new problems, this new space that emerged between bodies, we have the emergence of psychology and of course sociology at the beginning of the century, and essentially the problem of the other, studying how people interrelate. And what emerged out of this space, I would suggest, is not this anatomical body, this biological body, but a space for subjectivity, where subjectivity can be identified, crystallized, and studied. The mid-20th century, moving into more modern period, we have new sources of danger emerge, and they'll all be very familiar to you. They're still in the news, they're still in the newspapers. They weren't there at the beginning of the 20th century, but they're there now. And lots of others I'm sure you could add to that list. Now, how do we make sense of those? Well, there was a new public health strategy emerged at this time, and it was called, I suppose they're running out of names, they called it the New Public Health. And the New Public Health, the danger came not from other bodies directly, as they had earlier in the 20th century, but they came from the byproducts of social activity. It was all these other bodies interacting together to create this sort of industrial scale pollution. It was the dangers of other bodies, all those risks are somehow to do with the dangers of other bodies interacting together and affecting the individual. So how do we respond to this new source of danger? Well, we have ecological, green solutions. We move into a new world where nature is beneficent and not harmful as it had been in the 19th century. We identify risks everywhere, inside and outside the body, and these risks can't be handled by a cordon sanitaire and close policing. We've got to have constant vigilance. We always must be on guard against the risks that surround us, including ourselves. We ourselves become risky selves. And it seems to me that constant vigilance, constantly looking at yourself as a source of risk, creates a new identity, a reflexive identity. So if we analyse body spaces and boundaries through identifying where dangers emerge, we can identify three forms of body. There was an anatomical body in the mid-19th century. In the early 20th century, we have a psychosocial identity to that body. And in the late 20th century, we have more of a reflexive identity, which is picked up in contemporary literature, of course. And not to forget the Darwinists, bless them, they're still running up behind to catch up with this changing body, because as the body changes its identity and changes its shape, they've got to have some new theories. And it's not sufficient to have some African Rift Valley and evolution. They've got to go into sociobiology and behavioural genetics and so on to try and catch up with the body's changing shape. Now, I'll leave it to you to judge whether they've achieved anything there, but they're pretty desperate to follow on, because they've got to say this is unchanging. They've got to say this behavioural genetics, this has always been like this, rather than a recent invention we've somehow got to explain. Moving on to a second theme of Durkheim, which was time. He said that our sense of time derives from the rhythm of the collectivity. So we can begin to say, how has the body been structured in time in a temporal envelope? We say, when does the body begin? When does the body end? What happens in between? First, of course, there must be a body. So you can't have a theory of evolution, you can't have an explanation of the beginning of the body before you've got it. So, of course, any explanation of when the body starts can't happen before the middle of the 19th century, when there was a body. And as we know, as I pointed out, Darwin famously identified the origin of the body in 1859, 1871, in The Descent of Man, identify where the body came from, some distant evolutionary past. But I think it's interesting, and about the same time, slightly before Darwin, and I don't think he got the credit for it, the Registrar General was trying to establish at the time the number of live births as a denominator for infant mortality rate. If you want to calculate the infant mortality rate, you've got to have a denominator. How many live births are there in the population? Therefore, you've got to say, what is a live birth? And there's a big struggle. He debates different criteria, and eventually he says the body starts with a single gasp of air at birth. So as soon as you come out of the womb, if that infant takes one breath, then it is a live birth. So a different definition of when the body starts, quite different from Darwin's, but seems to me it's another register of saying when things start. When does the body end? In the 18th century, death was a natural event. The black-cloaked figure came from outside of life, knocking on the door and said, it's time to go. Sometimes you can defer it and tell them to go away, but eventually that figure comes and takes you away. And of course, we all know these image of the skeleton, the black-cloaked figure, scythe in hand, telling you it's time to go, that event when it's time to go. And of course, it can happen any time, let me warn you. But what happened with the new medicine, with the new biology, was that death was transposed from being a natural event to a pathological one. So we're not allowed any longer to die from natural causes. That was abolished, it still creeps in, but it was essentially abolished 150 years ago. So death's not from an external nature. It doesn't come from nature as a natural process of decay and eventually the black-cloaked figure taking you away, but it comes from a pathology inside the body. So our new conception of death is that death is inside of us, even at birth, and we're gradually dying. Just look at me. You can see that gradually we're fading because this is the new model. So death becomes an essential part of our new identity. As Michel Foucault, I've got to mention him briefly, he said, a wonderful quote, he says, "It is not because he falls ill that a man may die, but because he might die that he falls ill. It is death which defines what we conceptualize as illness rather than the other way around." Now, by the end of the 19th century, they'd managed to stop all doctors putting in died from old age, died from senility, died from natural causes. They sent all those death certificates back and said, give him a decent pathological cause of death, because he and she cannot die from a natural cause. So what we have at the end of the 19th century is birth, marking the separation from nature of this new thing, this human body, this anatomical body. We have sanitary science defining the boundaries, and we have pathological, not natural forces causing death. But there's a problem with this regime that once you've constituted, crystallized the body as a separate object, how are you going to get it back into nature? And this is a big problem for sanitary science during the latter decades of the 19th century, and they had lots of elaborate rituals to dematerialize this body and to get it back to nature. So there's about 50 burial acts in the final decades of the 19th century about the rules about how deep the coffin should be, how big the cemetery walls and so on, because there were dangers from corpses. Corpses were dangerous things, and we know that from all that contemporary literature also, from the fiction, premature burials. People are very frightened of premature burials, the undead, zombies and all that sort of stuff. So Van Helsing's tried to solve the problem of the undead. I don't think he did it terribly well, but my sole claim to fame is I have solved it, and here it is. So, the end of the 19th century, we have every body, because every body has this body, an anatomical body separated from nature with a beginning and with an end. Now, death, which was part of that reconstruction of the anatomical body, that pathological death, implied an anatomical identity. But as the identity changed during the 20th century, then that anatomical death could not remain. It was part of a different conception of what the body was. So how did that change? Well, in the 1950s, you can identify a new debate about whether people who are dying should be told whether they're dying or not. And suddenly in the 1960s, there's an explosion of literature looking at this great reversal in death. And instead of all your friends and relatives being the mourners at your death, the chief mourner has to be yourself. So you have to be told that you're dying, so you can experience this anticipatory grief. You can confess everything about dying to your medical attendants, and we move into a new regime of a liberal, free death, where it becomes much more normal to die rather than pathological. At the same time, post-mortems begin to disappear. What's the point of doing a post-mortem? Because whatever you find, it isn't terribly reliable. And so nowadays, very, very few patients get a post-mortem, whereas in the 19th century, early 20th century, they're much more common. But they don't matter any longer because we're losing the pathological cause of death. We're into this process of dying. And so we can identify over this period of the changing nature of the body, we can identify in the mid-19th century, natural, or up until the birth certificates in 1838, natural death from outside the body. Then we have this regime of pathological death, which death comes from inside the body. And finally, normal death, which in a way is from inside the mind, this new thing that we've got, where we can actually talk about what it's like, or the experience, or the feelings we have before we actually die. A brief word about some of the other concepts. Conscious time's pushing on. Time in between. It seems to me that the time of the body, between those beginning and ends, what's happened over the last 150 years has been segmented and drawn out. And there's literature to be written, I'm sure, about stages of development as we go through. Where did the idea that the body goes through these stages? Stages of dying we know about, they occurred in the 1960s. There's the reclassification of that whole early period of life, neonatal, post-neonatal, perinatal, and so on. We have the advent of chronic illness in the interwar years and its sudden explosion at the end of the 20th century. And this is essentially a temporal illness. As illness gets drawn out, instead of being a periodic event, it becomes a long process. And we've had a symposium just the other day on screening, the idea that there is a timeline to illness which can be exploited by medicine. Cause, Durkheim said, cause is not something that's out there, that's given. It's something that emerges from the human mind and the social mind in the social interaction. So the notion of causality reproduces the relationship between the individual and the social group. So when group attachment is strong, the world is a fatalistic one. Things happen willy-nilly. And when group attachment is weak, the world becomes more contingent. Now, I think we can identify this in some of the ways in which medicine has conceptualized etiology, as it calls, or the causes of disease. So in the 19th century, most diseases were caused by single events. There were things that caused, unicausal models. At the beginning of the 20th century, we have seed and soil explanations, where there is a cause, but also there's something resisting. There's a bimodal explanation of cause. In the late 20th century, we move into the modern era, where almost every illness nowadays has got multifactorial etiology, where there are very many risk factors surrounding every illness. And just to show you my favorite discovery of the last couple of years is Google Ngrams, where Mr. Google has digitized 5 million books and allows you to search them for free, word search them. Go on the net and you get these graphs out in about 3 seconds, 5 million books. And here, between 1800 and 2000, which comes up with automatically, I suppose I could have cut it down, but you can see that multifactorial etiology, you can see the blue line there, it doesn't exist prior to the 1960s and then suddenly explodes. This is the era we live in. We have a model of causality which somehow reflects the relationship of this new individual to the social collectivity. So more complex causal models reflect growth of individualization, and equally the growth of individuality reflected in the growth of multifactorial explanations of why disease arise. We can also look, I think, in recent years to another way we can explain things, which is becoming increasingly important, I think, and I can illustrate this by looking at how can behavior be explained. How do you explain how someone behaves? Well, a few decades ago, we searched for preceding factors that might predict it. What was somebody's age, their social class, their gender, and so on and so forth. Quantitative, positive methods dominated. And over the last few decades, much more important, I think, has been people's reasons. Why is it that something happens, and why do they do something? We want to listen to their reasons. Now, reasons and causes are not the same. They're different levels of explanation, but reasons located much more in the individual. And so there's a personal explanation of things, and we rely on qualitative interpret approaches. We can see this in examples about why patients go to the doctor in the 1960s. If you look at the illness behavior literature, it's entirely concerned with identifying the causal factors. From the 1980s onwards, we begin to get a literature which looks at patients' own explanations and reasons as legitimate explanatory forms. And also, another paper I've looked at, primary care classification, where primary care doctors are trying to classify the illnesses coming to them, and they try the ICD and they try all the traditional pathological models, and eventually in the 1980s they settle for the reason the patient came. That's the classification that's the dominant one in primary care classification. Why did the patient come? The reason, not the cause of them coming, but the reason they came. So I think we move into a new world where even causes themselves are becoming more problematic. And a brief word about personality, what Durkheim described as personality. What is identity? How's that identity changed over time? Well, I hope I've given you some indication of how that anatomical, psychosocial and reflexive body changed over time. But we can also look at that by studying how do we explain behavior. If we look at behavior in the 19th century, it only referred to inanimate objects. In the early 20th century, behavior came to apply to humans, so we have human behavior, but it tends to be a reaction to events. And famously, we have the psychological behaviourist models of stimulus-response. So it's a stimulus which triggers this response, some physiological process going on which triggers this response. And also there's a little bit of a morality, of course, to behaviour. There's still people who defaulted from treatment who were in some way morally culpable. In the early post-war years, we can see that something is happening because there's a lot of scientists who've been beavering away before the Second World War on all sorts of subjects which have got nothing really to do with behaviour, and then suddenly they move into human behaviour. So we have Kinsey, human sexual behaviour. We'll have all those ethologists who'd studied lots of animals before the Second World War, and suddenly they're writing tomes about human behaviour. They'd never studied human behaviour, but they infer from animal behaviour the way humans behave. And then famously we got Friedman and Rosenman. They'd be studying cholesterol in the laboratory, and suddenly they come up with type A behaviour as the explanation for why people have heart attacks. So great interest in behaviour. And of course we know that now. We know we live in this world where behaviour is a problem. It's a problem in public health programs. We now know there's a new role for medicine, changing patients' behaviour by addressing attitudes, intentions, self-efficacy, and so on, which is seen to underpin patients' choices and actions. So behaviour, from being caused in the early 20th century by this external event, becomes a product of agency and of self, the new model of who we are. And I did a little exercise looking through PubMed at all the different types of behaviour, and I see before this world emerged that we had everyday activities such as eating, smoking, exercising, driving, sleeping, drug taking and breathing, and nowadays we have eating behaviour, smoking behaviour, exercise behaviour, driving behaviour, and so on. We add behaviour to all our activities because we're focused on this new world in which we live. Now, Darwin's body, Durkheim's body, I've given you those contrasts between the two, and it seems to me one of the strengths of Durkheim's body, looking at Durkheim's body, is that whereas Darwin's body sees biologically sees a constant body, little changed over the 200,000 years or however long we've been fully evolved, and it's fixed by its very nature. Darwin's body is a fixed entity. But with Durkheim's body, we've got this changing body, which has changed over the last 2 centuries, which is still changing today, and a changing identity that goes along with it. And the richness of this change is it reflects contemporary society. So Darwin's body, because it's got a fixed identity, it tends to prioritise the author and the actor as the independent variable in explanations. And the great advantage of Durkheim's body, it seems to me, we can take the actor, the writer, the author, the person as the independent variable, but also we can see them as the dependent variable. We can actually begin to see what were the forces, what were the events, the texts, the actions which constructed identity, authorship, being an actor, and so on. So it's this ability to handle both the independent and the dependent variable in explanations, which seems to me a great strength. Now, how do we handle this conflict, this potential conflict between Darwin and Durkheim? Should we have a debate with biology? You notice I put up there's a book edited by Simon Williams and his colleagues. I usually in my talks have a little dig at Simon Williams, and as he's not here, it loses the force, so I'm very disappointed. But those of you who know him can tell him that I kept my tradition going by saying, what a load of rubbish. So should we have a debate with biology, as Simon suggested, a rapprochement even? I do have colleagues say we should have this rapprochement with biology and Darwin. And as I said, I think that's a complete waste of time. Don't go there. And why? Well, first of all, biology will dominate. If we start to engage with Darwin's body, then we will begin to get biology dominating. And look what's happened to psychology. It's very sad, really, that all those theories of the mind get dissolved away as they rush to do their neuroimaging and getting these pretty pictures, which they then somehow going to explain who we really are. And the reason why we shouldn't do that is what's the point of taking the back off the TV set to study the patterning of pixels when we are interested in what's on? You could spend 1,000 years studying the pixels in the TV set and you would not be able to tell whether you were watching Malcolm in the Middle or The Big Bang Theory. I've been told if I mention those, I'll appear less of a fuddy-duddy. But clearly, if you want to know what's on, we want to know what the program is, you don't study the pixels. In the same way, you can look at those pictures there I've shown you, however big a resolution, you get a great big scanner, which is a 50 Tesla scanner or something, and the resolution becomes incredible, and you study it for 1,000 years, you still wouldn't know what anyone was thinking. It's a waste of time. Don't go there. Darwin versus Durkheim, then, you don't have to choose. The solution seems to me to be disloyal. If you have to earn a living and the price they make you pay is loyalty, be a double agent. So can I commend that position to you, that intellectual position to you, while you wander through this Darwinian world? Thank you very much. In the absence of somebody saying thank you very much, can I thank myself very much? And it is now lunchtime.